Hallo Leute, ich bin Katja und ihr seht Deutsch für euch. So today we're taking on our first tempus, the present tense, or as we say in German, Präsens. I imagine this will be a relatively gentle start for you because you should know how this works already, at least subconsciously, if you've been watching my videos for a while. Since the endings of verbs are what indicates tense, I will not have to talk about how this tense is formed since I've already done that in the past. I talked about how to conjugate the verb sein in episode 15, followed it up with how to conjugate regular verbs in episode 16, and I also did a video on how to conjugate or how irregular verbs work in the present tense, and that was extra number 4. So if you haven't seen these 3 videos yet, you should check them out first, because I'm not going to go through what I explained in this video again. Also, if after this video you wonder how to form a sentence or you can't quite remember that anymore, review or watch for the first time my episodes on syntax, which start from episode 35. Well, after that introduction, what I want to talk about today mainly is when and how to use the Präsens. Seems fairly easy on the surface. You use it to talk about things in the present. Done. This gets a little bit more interesting though when we take a look at what English tenses the Präsens can be equivalent to. First of all, like I already mentioned in the introductory episode, we do not have the progressive aspect in German. So both the simple present and the present progressive are translated using the Präsens in German. Ich esse Kekse or ich esse gerade Kekse. I am eating cookies. Gerade means right now, so that is the adverb that we use when we want to express that something is currently going on. Ich esse immer Kekse. I always eat cookies. Ich esse gerne Kekse. I like to eat cookies. Meaning that we use the Präsens for things we're currently in the process of doing, so what is happening right now. Things we do regularly, so what happens usually, normally, regularly. Stative utterances, so statements about who we are, what we like, what we do, stuff that is seen as permanent and not changing ever, or at least not in a foreseeable future. Things that define you or other things. The earth is round, that kind of thing. So far this is actually easier than in English. No reason to worry. But of course there has to be a tricky part to it. In English you have this annoying little thing called the present perfect and consequently the present perfect progressive, which is not only a term that German school kids like to trip over when learning about the language, but also something that causes quite a lot of trouble when trying to find an equivalent for it. Because of its structural similarity and the name, Germans are often led to believe that this is somehow the same as our perfect, which it isn't. The present perfect, as I'm sure you know if you've ever thought about the grammar of your mother tongue at all, is pretty closely knit with the present tense, as indicated by the first part, present perfect. Most of the time, the present perfect in English gets used when we want to express that something started at a point before now and is still going on now and has been going on the whole time since then. These situations are called continuatives, so that's what I'm going to call them from now on, continuatives. While it's kind of nice to have a tense that is almost exclusively used for one single purpose, we do not need that kind of specific tense in German. As I have said before, did you see me slip in the present perfect there? Not that I had much choice, it's English after all. We have other means of specifying that. So when the present perfect or the present perfect progressive is used to describe a continuative in English, in German we translate that using the Präsens. Ich wohne seit 3 Monaten in Berlin. I've been living, or I have lived, in Berlin for 3 months. Ich gehe seit letztem Jahr zur Schule. I've been going to school since last year. Ich suche seit gestern danach. I've been looking for that since yesterday. So you might notice from this that the only thing that German really needs to express a continuative is the little word seit, which can be both since and for. We don't really make a difference there. It can even mean the very specific use of in, as in, I haven't seen you in days. Ich habe dich seit Tagen nicht gesehen. Pretty awesome, huh? Now, of course, this doesn't exhaust the usage of the present perfect in English, and so it also doesn't exhaust what it can be translated with in German, but the continuative is the present perfect's most important usage, and that is always translated using the presens. So again, a continuative is a situation or an action that started at some point before now and is still going on, happening, being done now, and also a state that came into existence at some point in the past and is still true for today. For example, I have been living in Berlin for 3 months. That is now part of my identity. I live here. That is what my home is since 3 months ago. If from this theoretical kind of finding out what the tense is, you still have trouble finding out whether you're faced with a continuative, and so whether you should translate using the presens or not, try this. Ask yourself whether the part after the since or for, or in some instances in, is essential in English. Is the information after since, for needed to make a coherent sentence? So, such as the two sentences, I've been going to school since last year, versus the sentence, I've gone to school. Because the last sentence could just mean that you've had a general education. So, if the part after since for, so since last year, is essential, then it is a continuative, and then you translate using the presens. And then lastly, the presens can be used to talk about the future, much like the present progressive in English. This actually happens even more often in German, especially in spoken language. Once again, this is because we use our tenses much more flexibly. Ich gehe morgen zu meinen Eltern. I'm going to my parents' place tomorrow. Kommt gleich nach Hause. He'll be home in a minute. Ich gebe dir das Geld nächsten Monat, okay? I'll give you the money next month, okay? Ich werde Mutter. I'm going to be a mother. I'm not, okay? I'm not. Wir finden sie schon. We'll find her. As you see from the first two examples, the most expressions that use the presens to express the future need some kind of time word, time adverb to make it clear that this is going to happen in the future. Or at least, if that is implied through the verb or through how the world works, at least to say when exactly in the future it will happen. There are some exceptions to this, for example, promises. These can go with a time word, like in number 2, or without one, like in number 4. This is because, of course, we know that a promise is inherently in the future, because you wouldn't have to promise to do it eventually if you'd already done it now. And number 3 is just a set expression in this case. We all know about how long a pregnancy lasts, so unless there is a context that asks for a specific time frame, we don't need one here. But in the vast majority of cases, this is one of the things that beautifully demonstrates that Germans need to accessorize. Linguistically speaking, of course. We need a lot more time adverbs and specifications to make clear exactly when something is going to happen, which you don't need in English because your tenses do that for you. Bald, gleich, später, sofort, danach or hiernach, and demnächst are the most important of these time adverbs, besides more specific expressions such as morgen or in 3 Monaten, stuff like that. There will be an episode on these time adverbs I just named next week, in which I will explain when exactly these are used normally. Once you know these, at least you know the gist of them, talking about the future will be a no-brainer, or at least a lot easier than English with all your will and going to and present progressive and Until we talk about the German future tenses, remember this. The presens can be and often is used to express the future in German, especially in spoken language, for which it is, most of the time, is combined with some sort of time expression. The two English future tense options it is the most closely connected to most of the time are will and the present progressive. Apart from that, and of course for the most part for the present tense, it is also used for continuatives, which make up about 80% of the usage of the present perfect in English. And that should sum up everything important there is to know about the presens. To get your own copy of the script for today's episode, support me on Patreon and toss me a note with an email address that you use for DropBox. I'll see you next week for extra on-time expressions. Until then, your random word of the week is der Krug. This, of course, is a very little one that you would normally call a vase, but I didn't have a bigger one. Bis nächste Woche. Tschüss!